Good afternoon. My name is Paul Ryer, and I'm the Director of Scholar Programs at the School for Advanced Research. And I am pleased to welcome you to today's colloquium presentation. Before I start, I have a few announcements. Firstly, the structure for the event today is as in the past. I'm going to introduce today's speaker, then we'll listen to his talk, and finally, Dr. Caldwell will join SAR President Michael Brown and myself for questions and answers. If you have a question, please type it into the question and answer field, comments field on the side of your screen at any time during the talk, and we will get those questions collated and do our best to answer as many as possible. This is the third of 5 colloquium presentations, and if you have missed any or won't be able to attend the following presentations, please check out SAR's YouTube channel. They will all be posted there as soon as we can get them up. Next week, our next colloquium presentation will be in 2 weeks, 2 weeks from now on Wednesday at 2 p.m., Wednesday, November 4th. And that will be a presentation by Alana Warner-Smith with a talk entitled Working Hands, Indebted Bodies, the Bioarchaeology of Labor and Inequality in an Era of Progress. As with our other talks, all are welcome, but please register in advance as you've done for this talk. We still have room in 2 of our courses for this fall. Next week's 2-part course on the Tulsa Race Massacre, the archaeology of the Tulsa Race Massacre, and a course on American law. For more details on those courses, please check the SAR website. And then a week from today, on October 28th, we are having a panel on the McGirt Supreme Court decision for Native American sovereignty in Oklahoma. That panel will have the same registration format again, GoToWebinar format. So please register in advance and you're more than welcome. Before introducing our speaker, I want to acknowledge that the SAR campus from which we're broadcasting this event is located on historically Tewa land, specifically Ogapoge, or the White Shell Water Place. Also, generous funding for this fellowship has been provided by the Katrin H. Lamon Foundation Endowment. It is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Robert Caldwell, SAR's 2020 to 2021 Katrin H. Lamon Fellow. Currently an assistant professor at the School of Arts and Sciences, SOWELA Technical Community College, Dr. Caldwell earned his PhD in history from the University of Texas, Arlington in 2018. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Caldwell for today's talk about his SAR book project titled Indians in Their Proper Place, Culture Areas, Linguistic Stocks, and the Genealogy of a Map.
Hello, my name is Robert Caldwell. I'm a 2018 graduate of the Transatlantic History Doctoral Program at the University of Texas at Arlington. I currently teach history and geography at SOWELA and McNeese State Universities in Lake Charles, Louisiana. I'm honored to be a Lamon Fellow at the School for Advanced Research for the academic year 2020 to 2021. I love maps. I have a great interest in indigenous cartographies, as well as the numerous kinds of ethnographic information that we might find in early colonial maps. But today, I'll be discussing a trend of ethnographic mapping in the 19th and 20th centuries. These maps were created to show the original homelands, languages, and culture elements of indigenous peoples inhabiting the lands that are now the United States. In the case of tribes of North America, the maps were created in the early 1800s to include the latest knowledge about tribes in the western half of the continent, alongside the locations of eastern tribes at the time of first sustained European contact. These maps provided a single visual document that purported to illustrate the ancient locations of tribes, their languages, and other important cultural or regional information. They offer the reader an immediate sense of the linguistic and political diversity of the North American continent at the time of European arrival. For over 150 years, these kinds of maps have been immensely popular, both amongst academics and the general populace, for their visual impact and pedagogical uses. These maps are not only a model of the past, they also provide map readers with an alternative geography of North America, one that they're probably not very used to. A native-focused alternative geography offers readers a model for reclaiming and imagining a decolonized future. The map here is William Sturdivant's 1967. These kinds of maps, first created by European and Euro-American geographers, initially depended on inside knowledge. They drew on a range of native informants and testimony of first-hand witnesses to create their maps. However, the resulting maps ultimately served to reduce a rich tapestry of indigenous knowledge to a kind of schematized generalizations about American Indian cultures. They also conveyed the numerous cultural biases of their creators. Over time, the map depictions ascribing territory and dividing political and culture areas became understood more as an established fact than as a model. In the worst instances, these maps reinforce the idea that American Indians are consigned to a static past, but one without our own dynamic history. These maps continue to be utilized by historians, anthropologists, cultural and regional geographers, and even in the field of Native American and Indigenous studies. But these maps are too often employed in an uncritical manner. There's a long-standing implicit tension between the benefits of the ethnological investigations and the resulting cartography on one hand, preserving which might have been lost or destroyed, and the complicity in colonization and civilization project on the other. My book traces this deep-rooted contradiction through the evolution of these kinds of thematic maps, excavating the relationship between politics and cartography, and noting the map's many uses throughout time. The research also offers important caveats regarding the limitations of utilizing such maps for present-day scholarship. My method is one of genealogy, or a triple genealogy, if you will. I look at the map's cartographic antecedents, I look at the intellectual history embedded within the maps, and closely related to the intellectual history, I also look at student-teacher relationships, the networks of these kinds of intellectual histories, if you will. Secondly, I use an evaluative methodology informed by ethnography and archaeology. In one sense, you might say that my work is that of a historian borrowing an archaeologist's trowel to uncover and carefully excavate the strata that are under Sturdivant's famous 1967 map, and to label the found artifacts. In another sense, I am working as a native ethnographer, drawing on Geertz's thick description and what Laura Nader has called studying up. I want to look at the lives and works of these dead white men who once wrote books and drew maps, pertaining to so-called small-scale or savage societies of this continent. This work relies upon knowledge generated in several fields, specifically the history of cartography and the history of social sciences in a transatlantic context. I have researched hundreds of printed primary sources and investigated numerous archives, including the American Philosophical Society, the National Anthropological Archives, the Bancroft Library, the Newberry Library, and I've corresponded with numerous archivists throughout the country and in Germany. But this work also intersects and overlaps with science and technology studies, the history of colonialism, imperialism, nationalism, race, American Indian history, and the growing field of Native American and Indigenous studies. But even though I'm utilizing a method of genealogy or archaeology, if you will, I'll be presenting today, like I will in my book, the way that most historians do, which is chronologically. I will start by talking about the intellectual environment in the late Enlightenment, in which Albert Gallatin produced his early 19th century map. Then I will cross over the Atlantic to rediscover German cartographies of native North America, then return back to Washington, D.C. to examine John Wesley Powell's Bureau of American Ethnology map, followed by Clark Whistler's early 20th century culture area maps. Then I will look at Alfred Kroeber and the Berkeley School and their maps before finally returning to the Sturdivant Map, which is the focus of this talk and my book. Ethnological and linguistic mapping came on the scene during the late Enlightenment at a time of the emergence of scientific racism and as a continuation of what has been called cartographic encounters in the context of earlier colonial maps, of domination of both the land and the past. These maps functioned as an important part of the visual record of Anglo-American dominance, co-constituent assimilation, genocide, and land dispossession, what Susan Schulten calls the march of territorial growth of the United States. Borrowing liberally from Clifford Geertz's concepts of models, these maps were both a tool for and a tool of the expansion of what became known as the social sciences. So what we're talking about here is the expansion of the social sciences, the expansion of nationalism and imperialism. The first linguistic and ethnological map of American Indians, created by Albert Gallatin, emerged during a period of rapid national expansion of the territorial claims of the United States and a deepening of transatlantic circulation of ideas in the late Enlightenment. This map by Gallatin, you can't necessarily see it within the map itself, but it was informed by hundreds of previous studies, going back to early maps like Reck and Adair and Romans, but also through diligent conversations that Gallatin had with Wilhelm and Alexander von Humboldt, Thomas Jefferson, and Stefan Duponceau. Many of the ideas were shaped about concerns regarding American Indians and central to what would eventually become fields of geography, anthropology, and linguistics. So this first chapter traces the process which the initial first-hand linguistic and ethnographic observation of colonial scholars met with German discursive frameworks, resulting in the development of authoritative maps that furthered imperialist agendas and initiated a new trend in cartography. Gallatin's map, shown here, was based on a table he first compiled called the Table of Indian Languages of the United States in 1826. He worked together with the War Department to try and get as many native vocabularies as possible. He wanted a full and complete picture of native vocabularies, and he often sort of conflated language and polity. So he calls it a table of Indian languages, but it's part of his synopsis of Indian tribes. Gallatin got a lot of support from Peter Stefan Duponceau, the president of the American Philosophical Society at the time. Duponceau, he relayed to Gallatin many reports, both from the War Department, Indian agents, and from other philologists at the time, and he encouraged Gallatin to continue his study of American Indian languages. Gallatin's early thematic map, which depicts the locations of tribes temporally at, quote, about 1600 in the east and 1800 westward, represents the beginnings of this form of anthropological cartography. The map also represents the genesis of maps that prioritize static and idealized aspects of American Indians' culture over any forms of culture change or distribution of any given moment at the past. So in this very map, you can see many tribes along the East Coast are depicted as they were at the time of European invasion or first sustained contact. At the same time, you'll see tribes noted in the West about 1800. So this map is a map of the time of first contact, some time without time, if you will. Not necessarily a given year, right? So this is what I'm talking about when I say that these are kinds of maps that consign indigenous peoples to the past forever, right? So Gallatin's map came out in many different editions between 1836 and 1850, and you can see here on the detail how they divide the tribes and language groups by color. Here's a French edition of the map, also from the 1830s, and it differs not only because the map is annotated in French, but also because, as you can see, there's an outline. I show in detail outline of this imagined new Indian territory where these tribes are being forced onto. This Indian territory is not just what we know as Oklahoma today, but also parts of Kansas and Nebraska. Here is a gem of a map that I found at the New York Public Library. And this map is a kind of missing link between Gallatin's map and some of the next maps I'm going to talk about. This map, if you can see, has been further annotated by hand, adding a number of new tribes and shading a number of new areas. It's thought that this map at one point was in the possession of Alexander von Humboldt. To build Gallatin's map, it took a lot of intellectual history. It took a lot of prior sources, and I try to map these in my genealogical charts, as you can see here. My second chapter looks at the expansion of nationalism in the United States and in Germany. And this first map that I'll be showing is one from Bancroft, and it's a great map. It shows tribes primarily in the east, and it builds upon Gallatin's map, although it only focuses on the East Coast. Now, Bancroft, the academic, Bancroft, the scholar, he did a world a great justice by creating this map, by being elected to the American Antiquarian Society in 1838, and by publishing a linguistic classification system of American Indian languages. At the same time, Bancroft, the politician, extended the American empire westward and displaced native and mestizo peoples. So these are the kind of contradictions that are embedded within these maps. Throughout this time, there was, a monumental kind of Western expansion in the United States. And there was also expansion in Germany. Industrialization, the railroads, and continued westward expansion transformed North America, including Indian country, through the alienation of native lands and treaties with Britain, Mexico. The United States was able to double its size, becoming a global superpower. And at the same time, the transportation revolution facilitated continuous U.S. expansion, eventually integrating the continent from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean. In Europe, Germany displaced France as a global center of learning and innovation, and by 1871, Prussia managed to coalesce most of the German-speaking states into a new nation. Heinrich Berghaus's map the Ethnographic Map of North America expanded Gallatin's, especially in the western portion of North America. It drew heavily on Gallatin's work, but it expanded upon it. If you can take a look at the map detail at the bottom right, it will show that Berghaus gave credit to Gallatin, but also Alexander von Humboldt and a number of other people. This work was part of Berghaus's physical atlas and is indicative of the geographic, scientific, and publishing preeminence of Berlin and Leipzig in the 19th century. This masterfully illustrated color map coded over 30 tribal groups and was first to divide tribes into geographical regions. A smaller inset map on the left of it detailed the European language spoken on the continent at the time. The divisions on the main map were marked by language and tribe families. It's kind of interesting that you see these two maps together in dialogue. Two maps of non-contemporaneous ethnic groups, the main map of tribal groups going back to the time of first contact, and on the inset, the European languages that were spoken in the Americas mid-19th century. But in the era of unquestioned lineal progress, such maps were very commonplace. There were multiple versions of Berghaus's physical atlas, and the 1890 version done by his nephew, Hermann Berghaus, also included ethnographic maps of North America. As you can see here, you have on the left in the expansive continent of North America with various tribes shown either detailed by their name or by a number in the map legend. And on the right, you see an early version of language groups of California. These kinds of maps detailing the numerous language groups and tribes of California continue throughout the entire 20th century. Again, here is my genealogical chart of the information and the networks that are behind Berghaus's maps, the maps of the mid-19th century and the maps done by Hermann Berghaus, his nephew, later in the 19th century. By the late 19th century, John Wesley Powell wrote about the production of a new map of North America to illustrate the new knowledge gained by government and social scientists regarding the languages and territories of the indigenous peoples of North America. His new map of linguistic stocks of American Indians would become the hallmark of the Bureau of Ethnology, a new government agency that Powell directed. Powell's maps colorfully illustrated over 50 linguistic families stretching from Alaska to Mexico, a visual display of the wealth of U.S. knowledge regarding Americans, and a newfound attitude in Washington, D.C., that American Indians were not just a persistent problem to be dealt with, but an important topic of scientific investigation as well. After the Civil War, the quickly growing federal government sought to populate their expanding territories with settlers, occupying native lands by redeploying the post-Civil War military westward and integrating the continent by the building of transcontinental railroads. Along with this extension of power, the government would utilize the new sciences to better understand the lands and peoples of the West. Powell's linguistic stocks of American Indians north of Mexico, created by the Smithsonian's Bureau of American Ethnology, synthesized the enormous amount of materials collected since Gallatin to demystify American Indians in the era of U.S. expansionism. The map underwent multiple revisions and subsequent publication until 1915. It was utilized in the 1890 census and at the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition. The period was one of rapid change throughout the United States, including Indian country. While politicians in Washington were still interested in questions of Indian pacification and resettlement, and by this time allotment, anthropologists were conducting salvage ethnography to understand and document quickly changing indigenous cultures. As I said, Powell's maps underwent numerous revisions. The early 20th century versions incorporate Cuba and Puerto Rico, which is interesting as U.S. imperialism expands into the Caribbean. Once again, here's a chart, sort of genealogical chart of networks and ideas and organizations that fed into Powell's map. My next chapter focuses on salvage ethnology, disappearing Indians, and the American School of Anthropology. And a lot of that focus is on Franz Boas, the father of American anthropology, who brought German social science to the United States, and one of his understudies, Clark Whistler. Whistler fused concepts borrowed from German scholarship with American pragmatism, and he popularized the culture area concept in the U.S. So this chapter elaborates the intercultural transfers between Germany and the U.S., especially on the ideas of culture area, and it details the popularization of culture area as a kind of way of understanding about Native peoples. Whistler's trait distribution maps were utilized for a culture area map that created 10 regions based entirely on the foodways of the tribes of Native America. Maps based on the distribution of materials laid the groundwork for geographical divisions on subsequent culture area maps. Whistler's maps also reflect the kind of very simple graphic and text-heavy maps that came into vogue in the United States at the time. This has also been linked to the technology known as the wax engraving method, a very affordable but low-quality option for mass-producing maps that gained widespread appeal. You can see in these maps they're very simple. They look like they could be woodcut maps or something like that. But this kind of thing increasingly became in vogue in the United States in the early 20th century. After World War I, Albert Kroeber, another student of Boas, catapulted the Berkeley anthropology program into an international powerhouse. Kroeber did a lot of documenting the culture of California. He and his students popularized the culture area concept, and he considered culture and natural areas together. Kroeber's Ethnographic Map of California Peoples, part of his monumental Handbook of California Indians, synthesizes demographics, linguistics, social structures, religion, folkways, and material culture all into one map. Despite his research and the book's heft, Kroeber appealed to everyday readers by combining state boundaries and culture areas. Now, this foreshadowed his more comprehensive culture and natural areas of North America, but it also established the basis for state-level ethnology of American Indians for most of the 20th century. This map is a continental-wide map also created by Kroeber, and this map is part of Native Tribes of North America. It's a great example of Kroeber combining both cultural and natural areas. So he used overlays, numerous overlays of maps showing where tribes existed historically, elements of their culture, whether it be clothing, etc., together with things like isothermic lines or annual temperatures or what kinds of flora and fauna were in a certain place. So this combining of cultural and natural sort of elements became a major theme in maps of Native North America. Now, Kroeber worked together with Carl O. Sauer, the geographer at Berkeley, also with H.E. Bolton, the historian. And I argue in the book that there becomes this sort of Berkeley synthesis. An American anthropogeography emerges. Here's a very simplified chart showing some of the relationships of people in and around Kroeber at the University of California at Berkeley. Finally, we get to the Sturdivant Map. This map is the map that really started me thinking about this whole trend. It's created by Smithsonian curator William C. Sturdivant, and it sort of represents the apex of anthropological mapping in the United States. It's a sort of culmination of all of the other maps I've shown, of the European and Euro-American geographic, ethnological, and linguistic knowledge about the American Indian past. This map follows many of the trends in prior maps. Along the East Coast, it's about the time of first contact, 1600 or thereabout. And as you go west, and especially into the interior west, the dates come closer and closer to our present time. On the same map, you find Aboriginal homelands in the 16th century, the late 1500s, and peoples who were still occupying their historic land base in the late 19th century. This map sort of becomes also a model. It's a sort of outline, if you will. Sturdivant's monumental multi-volume Handbook of American Indians, one of the largest undertakings of the late 20th century. And you can see that the book, in many ways, utilizes this map as a model. This map does multiple things at once. You look at it and it's highly visual, stimulating colors, but it attempts to include tribes, in other words, polities, culture areas, and language all in the same map. As you can imagine, there are a lot of questions that can arise from this. It's at once very interesting and useful. On the other hand, the first time I saw this, I wondered, what about my own ancestors? Wait, some of our ancestors here grouped under Choctaw, these towns were brutal enemies with each other, despite sharing a language, right? The polity wasn't that of the European nation state of the 19th century. It was more of a village-based or city-state type polity. Another thing that stands out about this map is that the color ends where the contemporary border of the United States ends, right? So this map is a nationalistic map. It's a product of the Cold War, but at the same time it has some use as a heuristic device. After World War II, social scientists, supported by the government and private and philanthropic foundations, marshaled all this information that they had gathered before and all the theoretical models that they had gathered before, and they rendered these tribal maps more, quote, accurate. So if you're looking for accuracy in some sense, this is a map to look at. But again, you start to pull it apart. The map shows static borders, hard and fixed lines. But many tribes at different times in history have had something less of what we might call a territory than multiple forms of territoriality. Yes, we might live in a certain place, and no, you should not try to come and take that place. On the other hand, we may use certain adjacent lands for gathering only seasonally, and our neighbors may use those same lands for hunting. These kinds of nuances can't be depicted in such of a map. Also, we may have had shared cultural patrimony in the past. These kinds of things don't get reflected on such a map. But by the late 20th century, this kind of map becomes a fact in and of itself. People start utilizing this map for all sorts of reasons that the creator of the map knew this map could not do. For issues like NAGPRA, for example, or land claims. This map is a useful heuristic device, but we have to understand it for what it is, including the suppositions of its creators and its deep and complex genealogy, its cartographic antecedents, the intellectual history behind it, and the fact that ultimately, despite this being a map focused on Native peoples, this is a colonial map. My book will establish a cartographic history genealogy of this map, this Sturdivant Map, entitled Early Indian Tribes, Culture Areas, and Linguistic Stocks. It will introduce the readers to Sturdivant's map and elucidate the influences over 150 years of prior mapping. Hopefully today I gave you a brief introduction of some of the intellectual history and the growth of social sciences that happened during the times of the creations of these maps. And most importantly, the institutions as they related to the mapping of Indian country. My work hopefully also reveals the transatlantic history of corresponding colleagues, teacher-pupil relationships, and mentor-protege relationships, without which the Sturdivant Map would have never been created. The ethnological and linguistic mapping of Indian country was a transatlantic enterprise, but a circuitous one. From the time of first exploration and discovery, or invasion, if you will, of the Americas, Europeans created maps to illustrate waypoints, to aid returning voyages to their destinations. Maps were also used to survey a world that was new to them, demarcating friends and foes for potential trading partners, for natural resources, and most of all, to name and claim lands for their own European countries. From the earliest mapping endeavor, ethnographic information was recorded that future social scientists would mine for thematic maps detailing tribal homelands, historic language distribution, and culture areas. That tradition of mapping culminated in Sturdivant's map. Now, you may want to ask me, Robert, Sturdivant's map was created 50 years ago. What about mapping since? And my book will include an epilogue. The epilogue will talk about mapping in the age of the Red Power movement until present, possibilities for decolonizing cartographies, the emergence of tribal GIS, native entrepreneurial mapping. There's a whole trend of native people creating our own maps and sometimes selling them, and large-scale collaborative endeavors that include geographers, other social scientists, and native tribes and peoples. I want to thank, first and foremost today, the School for Advanced Research, Emery Joseph Denhart, who is my Doktorvater, the American Philosophical Society, the American Antiquarian Society, the Newberry Library, the Smithsonian, most importantly, the National Anthropological Archives, the staff at the Bancroft Library at UC Berkeley, the David Rumsey Map Collection, and my elders, my friends, and my family, and all of the loved ones who have offered immense support for me over the years and made this book project possible. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Robert. That was really, really interesting from start to finish. We are going to alternate reading out the questions of audience members as they have written them. Michael, do you want me to take the first one, or do you have it queued up?
Why don't you go ahead, Paul?
Okay, excellent. The first question is from Luis Lorenzo. What is your criteria to keep avoiding Southwest and West mapping and already functioning information by the mid-1800s? You mentioned a few times sustained contact, as if it was just the East colonies, as well as the Western and German expansion, the ones that were prominent. How is that? Kudawaha, Professor.
So I don't think that I avoid the West. What I'm looking at primarily is main trends and this kind of mapping. By the time of John Wesley Powell, the West and Southwest are properly represented, at least represented in some way, certainly on Whistler's and Kroeber's maps as well in much more detail. Many of these early maps, Gallatin especially, and Bancroft, etc., they really only focus on east of the Mississippi and a handful of tribes that they had known about, because these maps range from the 1830s all the way to 1970, and so the European and Euro-American knowledge base differed over time. Of course, amongst different scholarly groups, some knew more than others about certain regions. Certainly, Spanish sources would be much better for the Southwest and California. If my work comes across as prioritizing or deprioritizing a region, hopefully that's only in reflection to my critical analysis of those maps.
I've got a question from Leanne Foster. It's actually a practical question. Is there some way for us to download these maps, or maybe putting it another way, can you recommend sources that people can access these and other maps? I mean, just as a footnote, I should say, I was kind of struck when you were talking about the Handbook of North American Indians, and Sturdivant obviously was the senior editor of that. That project was supposed to be completed in time for the bicentennial. When I was a Smithsonian fellow in the early 1980s, I think they'd put out 4 or 5 volumes, and I'm not 100% sure that it's been completed to this day. So it had some of the same problems that maps themselves. You make you know, important observations about how maps, well, they're inherently static, and yet some of the maps you talk about are actually sort of atemporal, and that there's, you know, there's early colonial stuff, and then there's more recent context. And the same problem has come up with the Handbook of North American Indians, which is, I think, scrambling to try to bring the final volumes into conformity to the way Native Americans talk about their own societies and their own history, which was very different in you know, in 1976 or the early 70s, when the whole idea of the thing was launched. It was incredibly, insanely ambitious project. I'm sure well-intentioned, and you could say that it was a way of sort of bringing Native America. At the time we're celebrating, you know, the bicentennial of the United States, of honoring Native Americans. And when I say that, I'm not denying for one second the colonialist agenda that the map making is associated with. Anyway, so to get back to the original question, what do you recommend for people who'd like to see some of these maps?
So there's not really a single portal as of yet, although I hope to work on such a project. Many of the maps that I showed in the slides came from the Library of Congress. Certainly you can get some of Powell's maps there, Sturdivant's map there, some of the German maps. The David Rumsey map collection online is a great source. So, but if you want some of the other ones, feel free to write me. You can check out my website at robertbcaldwell.com, and there's contact information there, as well as some additional visual information on these maps.
Thank you.
Here's a question from Scott Ortman. I'm wondering if you've looked at mapping efforts related to tribal land claims, like the Zuni Atlas. It seems like that source avoids some of the reifications you describe in some interesting ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And there are numerous maps of specific tribal areas, and maps that have been created by Native peoples that are far more useful in understanding certain elements, right, of the geography. But what I wanted to focus this book on is primarily these maps of continental wide scope or US wide sort of scale, because these are the maps that are most often used for pedagogical devices, especially for high school and for introductory level classes in colleges. And so these kind of maps get a lot of they get a lot of airtime, and I want to be able to sort of to critique them, to be able to pick them apart a bit, and to, if people choose to continue to use them, at least do so with some caveats, right? I mean, these kind of tools or texts are like almost any other. They might shed a certain light on certain things and obscure others, and so I'm primarily focused on these continental-wide scopes. But I would like to discuss specific maps, especially as it relates to land claims, because these kind of maps, including also maps of very localized hunting territories, things of that nature, I think would be a great investigation for another book.
Your discussion reminds me of one of my favorite ethnographies of all time. It's Hugh Brody's Maps and Dreams. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but Brody's a British anthropologist who was hired by an oil pipeline company to do interviews with Dene-speaking Beaver Indians up in British Columbia. And he discovered, and of course it was a mapping project, but it turned out that a lot of their sense of territories were based on the dreams of hunters and shamans. And so he alternates maps chapters with dreams chapters, and it's a real lesson in just radically different ways of looking at space and time. And it's a beautifully written book. Maria Spray on our staff asks a kind of related question. Would it be possible to create an accurate map now, and accurate in quotation, you know, scare quotes, I guess? Is it even necessary to do that these days?
Yeah, so there are some interesting projects going on. I don't argue that these maps are flawed, and so I can create a better one or something like that. I do think that maps created by Indigenous nations, sometimes by clans or families even, can be useful and sort of filling in the gaps. And I know there's some really amazing projects going on in Indian country right now, ranging from resource GIS type stuff all the way to looking at historic, looking at important cultural sites, etc. And so I think that there will be space in the future to do a new kind of massive kind of mapping that will include all sorts of overlays, nuances, etc. Some of these anthropologists try to do that in the 30s and 40s with like I think acetate sheets and other kinds of overlays, and experimented with using multiple colors and lines and things like that. But I think that the ability to do those kinds of maps that will allow us to zoom in and zoom out, right? To look at some nuance and to create maps that are much more collaborative between the various First Nations and academics. So I look forward to that. But the purpose of my book is not to try and say, you know, I have the answer here and this is the alternative map.
Well, you may have already addressed this next question, but let's see if there's some elements here that are new. Question from Jana Batman. Since these maps are a somewhat inaccurate portrayal of Indigenous people and their linguistic and cultural histories, what are good ways to utilize those maps as they exist? And to follow up, if you were to create more accurate mapping of the linguistic and cultural histories of Indigenous people, what changes could or would need to be made?
So I think that these kinds of maps can be useful. First, they're highly useful in teaching what Europeans and Euro-Americans, especially social scientists, what we now call social scientists, how they saw Native peoples at the time. I think that these maps are also, especially the Sturdivant Map and ones like it, can be very useful, at least initially, as a teaching tool. My hope is that people would simply employ the asterisk, right? I mean, to use them with a certain caveat, right? I've many times, as I've noticed and noted, these maps are treated as a sort of as the reality, and they're not. They're a model like any other.
Your fellow scholar, Scott Ortman, has a question. The fact that these ethnographic maps represent a fictional moment of first contact makes me reflect on the idea of land acknowledgements. Is there a danger when referring to lands today as lands of specific tribes when these tribes didn't have boundaries as we know them today?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I think that it's important to realize there were first peoples here, right? And for me, land acknowledgements are important. However, I think that the notion of exclusivity when it comes to territory is a really slippery slope. And that's what I try to show within the book. The idea of imposing this sort of like fictionalized territory, especially the European or really, I would say, German nationalist sense of what it means to be a people, a nation. This conflation of blood or ethnicity and polity and territory as all being the same. And we know through study of history, it's rarely always all the same, right? So when I look at a number of urban areas, it's important to realize that different peoples have lived on that landscape throughout time. And I think that many people do a great job of acknowledging the many peoples who have lived on that landscape prior to the United States, prior to Euro-American habitation.
Yeah, that's great.
I hope that answered your question, but we could talk about it more. It's a good one to ponder.
Definitely takes me back to reading Johann Herder and the kind of German notion of Kultur, and how that has echoed down to the present, and certainly in anthropology. Question from Emily Sanatham. How do indigenous forms of map making of the same period compare to these European and Euro-American maps, particularly in their inclusion of transportation routes, foodways, and natural elements?
Oh, so this is a great question, and I think no one has done any kind of large-scale sort of study. But the short answer is that many native maps, including those that were eventually sort of utilized by anthropologists and turned back into maps that look like this, look quite a bit different. And so these, I would say, they reflect very different notions of spatiality and very different notions of importance. And waterways for transportation, hunting areas, gathering areas, also other physical features and neighbors often play a big part of these kinds of maps. The sad part is I think it will be very difficult to do full justice trying to put these kinds of maps side by side, because many of the native maps are were ephemeral. They didn't last long. Some continue to exist in various places, but some were literally drawn in the dirt and copied by Europeans. Many were on materials that were not preserved, and so it's hard trying to find maps. Also, I think the scale is often quite a bit different. But it is a good question, like how can we do a kind of interesting comparative piece of native created maps in this period. I think that what it will ultimately require is maps that at least look at the same general scale. And so I'm not aware of many native maps that look at the entirety of North America or the claims of the United States prior to the 20th century.
Well, here's a related question from Carol McLennan. Are Indigenous cartographers developing a way to show the changing territoriality of Native history where there were both shared cultural and natural resources and separated territories?
I think some people are doing just that, and it's a very exciting project, and that's something I will definitely discuss in my book after the Sturdivant Map. These kind of projects are varied, and I'm hearing about new ones all the time. So if someone's out there watching and you're participating in such a project, please let me know. I'd love to feature your work in the book. There is a massive one going on right now. It's I talk about it in my dissertation in the Canadian state, and it's gone beyond the borders of the Canadian state, and I'm not sure if it goes south of the territorial claims of the U.S. yet, but it's certainly a work in progress. This sort of crowdsourced.
Here's a question from Brittany Jimenez. What is your take on the government still using these outdated, misinformed maps to delegitimize historic tribes in regards to federal recognition?
Yes, these kinds of maps are often used in ways that even their creators couldn't have imagined. And the one that annoys me the most as far as issues of federal acknowledgement is the Royce Map series. I don't really discuss it in this book. It's another project entirely, but the Royce Maps of the 1890s were sort of pre-maps to the Indian Claims Commission maps, and in those maps, I think the United States was really trying to CYA the Louisiana and East Texas region where I'm from. It's just a blank space on that map, so they basically said, well, the French and Spanish were here before the United States acquired this territory, so we don't have a responsibility. Never mind their inherent responsibility, never mind their treaties that they made with, say, for example, France. I think Article 6 of the Louisiana Purchase Treaty says that the United States will continue to honor the arrangements between the native peoples and the Spanish government. So yeah, a lot of these maps overlap. Also, I think part of the thing of this maps, you're looking at times of first contact and this idealized nature, this unchanging culture, these kinds of ideas that maybe some anthropologists once had, and certainly some people in the BIA have had. Peoples whose culture was created through contact, right? Through displacement, through amalgamation, accurately represent those tribes at the time of first contact? And I mean everything from some of the lesser known state recognized tribes in Louisiana today to tribes that everyone knows their names, like the Seminoles, right? I mean, first contact might have been with ancestors who share who now have a very different polity, right? Because native nations were transformed through invasion, through interaction with Europeans, and with the creation of new states. In fact, you know, you could even argue that native nations as we know them were created as a response or in dialogue to those other new nations like the United States or Mexico, etc.
Is it my turn, Paul? I can't remember.
So. I think it's your,
Well, we only have time for a couple more questions here. Alina asks, first, she thanks you for your presentation. And she says, can you tell us more about how these evolving maps shape the nation-making process in the US? Was the Berkeley School, for example, comparing what it was found in the US with other places such as Latin America?
Yeah, that's interesting, especially with the Berkeley School and its relationship to Latin America. Yeah, I think that some of these ideas, these anthropogeographical concepts that came out of the Berkeley School, you have figures like Paul Kirchhoff, who was this German social scientist who he was a leftist, and he fled the Nazis, and he came to Berkeley for a while, and eventually he went on to be a big shot in Latin Americanist history and archaeology, coming up with these kind of grand notions like the Mesoamerican culture concept, right? And so I think that the relationship of those projects, those sort of colonial projects of the Berkeley School in Mexico and Central America certainly are understudied, and their relationship to US foreign policy also relatively understudied, but I've uncovered a number of documents that would suggest that there is a strong relationship. I know there are others who are much more knowledgeable about US colonialism and anthropology in Mesoamerica than I. So I'm sorry, I don't have a good answer, but I think the Paul Kirchhoff piece is a really interesting piece, and I sort of note it as more or less of a footnote. I'd love to do more research on him.
Thank you. Paul?
We have a question here from senior scholar Deb Winslow. I found your talk very interesting, but I missed consideration of the Neo-Boasian movement in the early 21st century in anthropology.
I'm sorry, it's cutting out a bit.
Sorry about that. Yeah, the Neo-Boasian movement in anthropology, early century.
Early 21st century?
Early 21st. They argue that the Boasians emphasized plurality of perspectives and the permeability of apparent borders, and thus still have something to teach us today. Are you aware of that work, and do you have an opinion about it?
I need to learn more about the work. I certainly know that there are numerous people who sort of in many ways a rehabilitated Boas. From my perspective, he didn't really, I'm sorry to say this, but he really didn't need a lot of rehabilitating. Probably most of my mentors stretch back to students and grand students of Boas. My bigger concern with Boas was some of the excesses of some of his students, especially Clark Whistler, people that really bucked Boas in many ways and went into some, pretty nefarious, ideas. So, but I'd be happy to read about this Neo-Boasian school. I think maybe some of the authors I might know, but hope that was a useful response.
We're just about out of time. Let's end with one last question, with apologies to those of you who sent praise to Professor Caldwell and best wishes, and submitted other questions that we just don't have time for. But this one comes from Patricia Norby. She asks, regarding exclusivity, can you elaborate on the exclusion of Mexican indigenous communities from the Sturdivant Map? It seems like a dramatic shift from Kroeber's 1939 map.
Yeah, so these kinds of maps go back and forth between a hyper focus on the lands that are claimed by the United States and something beyond that. And you get that even with Powell's map. One of the most common versions is actually in the title, north of Mexico, but you get some of northern Mexico. It's a huge problem. It's a huge problem to sort of end an investigation of native lands, of native territories, where this, now the Trump border wall exists. It's complete crap. Excuse my language, but I mean, it should be obvious to almost anyone that that not only historically did native land claims transcend such colonial borders, but they continue to do so today. And this is why I described Sturdivant's map as being a nationalistic map and being, in many ways, a product of the Cold War.
Robert Caldwell, thank you for a fantastic talk, very memorable. We had almost 100 people in attendance. We look forward to seeing our audience at other events, including the McGirt v. Oklahoma discussion next week with 2 Native American attorneys. We've got a lot more on the agenda, so we hope to see many of you and more of you at our future events. But thank you very much, Robert. And I look forward to seeing you on campus, even if we're masked at the time.
That was terrific. Thanks. I wish we had time to get to more questions. There were a lot. It's very generative. So thank you so much. And I look forward to more conversations.
All right. Thank you all.